SEAL Rookie asked her if she was lost. Iron SPECTRE made every veteran stand at attention. The letter arrived in the third week of March 1987, and Margaret Vane set it on the kitchen table without opening it for 2 days. She was 34 years old, had been welding pipe fittings at the Caldwell Industrial Plant in Horner County, West Virginia, since 1979. 8 years of 6-day weeks, steel-toed boots, and coming home smelling of flux and burning metal. Her hands told the story better than she did. Rough at the knuckles, smooth at the palms from gripping the torch handle, and marked at the right thumb with a crescent scar from a slag blowback in 1983 that her foreman called a rite of passage and she called a Tuesday. The letter was from the United States Marine Corps Logistics Command. She opened it on a Wednesday morning before her shift, read it twice, set it back down. It was a contract inquiry, the kind that came through civilian procurement. The Marines needed a specialized bracket fabrication system for field deployable equipment mounts, something that could handle repeated thermal stress, resist corrosion in high humidity environments, and be assembled in under 4 minutes by personnel without specialized tools. 3 vendors had already submitted. All 3 had submitted aluminum alloy designs. The letter asked if Caldwell Industrial was interested in a 4th submission. The plant manager, Gary Tisdale, had forwarded it to her because she ran the fabrication floor. Had been running it for 3 years. Tisdale's handwriting at the top of the page said only, "Your call." Probably not worth our time. Margaret folded the letter, put it in her jacket pocket, went to work. The Caldwell plant ran 2 shifts. Margaret ran the first. 51 welders, 11 press operators, 4 quality control staff. They made pipe flanges primarily. Also some specialized mounting hardware for the oil and gas sector. The work was repetitive and hot, and the tolerances were tight enough that 1/8 of an inch off on a flange face meant the whole run went to scrap. Margaret had built her reputation on not scrapping runs. She pulled out the letter again at lunch, sitting on a stack of grating near the north wall where the welding smoke didn't collect as badly. Read the technical specifications a 3rd time. The Marines wanted a bracket that could mount communications equipment to vehicle roll bars, field desks, and weapon platforms interchangeably. The mount points were 3 different diameter ranges. The existing aluminum designs, per the letter, had been field tested and failed under sustained vibration cycles above 40 Hz. The aluminum fatigued. Cracked at the collar seam. She ate her sandwich and looked at the steel stock racks across the floor. Aluminum fatigued at collar seams when the wall thickness wasn't matched to the vibration frequency. She'd seen the same problem in the oil field mounting hardware. Same failure mode. Same cause. Different application. Same physics. She finished her lunch in 11 minutes. Went back to the floor. That evening, she stayed 2 hours past the end of first shift. Used the plant's drafting table, the one behind the supervisor's cage that nobody touched, because Tisdale had bought an IBM PC the year before, and everyone was supposed to be using that now. She used a pencil and a steel ruler and the technical specs from the letter, and sketched out 4 different collar configurations, all in 4130 chromoly steel. Not aluminum. Not what they'd asked for, technically, but the specs were performance-based. They'd asked for something that survived 40 hex sustained vibration, not something made of a specific material. She went home at 9:15. The house was quiet. Her husband, Dale, was already in bed. He worked the pre-dawn shift at the Morgantown glass plant, which meant the 2 of them lived on opposite sides of the clock most of the week. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the sketches for another hour. Then, she went to bed. By the end of April, she had a prototype, It had taken 6 weeks of evenings and 3 Saturdays and $340 of her own money for materials. The collar system she'd designed used a split-ring compression joint instead of a threaded collar. The split ring distributed load across 360 degrees of contact instead of concentrating stress at the thread roots. Under vibration, the ring tightened rather than loosening. Under thermal cycling, the expansion gap she'd engineered at the seam accommodated dimensional change without cracking. She called it the Vane Integrated Retention System on the technical drawings. 2 other people at the plant called it the VERS bracket. The third person she showed it to, a quality control inspector named Bert Hollis, who had 22 years of aerospace parts experience before coming to Caldwell, looked at the split-ring collar for about 45 seconds and said it would work. That was the most enthusiastic endorsement Bert Hollis had ever given anything. The submission went in on May 3, 1987. She sent it herself. Tisdale had declined to be listed as a point of contact. The submission included 3 prototype brackets, a 47-page technical specification document she'd typed at the library on their IMS Electric, and a cover letter on Caldwell Industrial letterhead that Tisdale signed without reading. The response came 6 weeks later. A phone call to the plant. Not to Tisdale. To her. The voice on the other end belonged to a procurement officer named Lieutenant Colonel Frank Ebers, based out of Quantico, Virginia. He said the prototypes had been forwarded to the field testing unit at Camp Lejeune. He said the VERS bracket had passed the vibration tests. He said it had passed the thermal cycling tests. He said it had passed the tool-free assembly test at 3 minutes and 42 seconds. He said there was a problem. The problem was the vendor qualification process. Caldwell Industrial was a pipe flange manufacturer. Its quality certifications covered carbon steel pipe components. The VERS bracket was a structural hardware component for military application. Different certification category. Different audit requirements. The procurement process required a compliant vendor. Caldwell Industrial was not a compliant vendor. Ebers said the Marine Corps was interested in the design. He said that clearly and without qualification. He said the 3 aluminum vendors' designs had all failed the vibration testing, including one from a defense contractor that had submitted a proposal worth $2.4 million. The VERS bracket was the only design that passed all 3 test categories. He said there were options to explore on the certification side. He said he'd be in touch. The call lasted 11 minutes. Margaret wrote down every word on a yellow legal pad. Then she called Gary Tisdale into his own office and told him what Ebers had said. Tisdale's response was to light a cigarette and lean back in his chair. He said the certification process for military hardware was a 2-year minimum. Said it cost more than the contract would likely pay. Said it probably wasn't worth the plant's time to pursue. Said the design was impressive, but maybe she should look at licensing it to one of the bigger outfits, the defense contractors, see if they'd want to buy the spec. She listened to all of it. Then she asked him if the plant would cover the certification costs if she managed the process herself. He thought about it for a while, then said that was her decision to make. She drove home that evening on Route 33 through the hill country, with the windows down and the late June air coming through warm and carrying the smell of wet clay from where the road crew had been grading the shoulder. She drove slowly, thought about what Ebers had said, thought about what Tisdale had said, thought about 2 years and the cost of audits and what it meant to have a design that had outperformed every defense contractor on the floor. She turned into her driveway at 6:47 in the evening, went inside, made dinner. Didn't say anything to Dale about it over the meal. After dinner, when he was watching the news, She sat at the kitchen table again with the legal pad. She wrote down every step of the MIL Q9858A quality system certification. Had gotten the requirements document from a library in Morgantown that carried federal procurement publications. Read through all 38 pages. Made notes. Built a timeline. The certification audit process, done correctly, took 18 months minimum and required documented process controls, calibration record, corrective action systems, and an on-site audit by a Defense Contract Management Agency representative. She went to bed at midnight. The legal pad had 4 pages of notes. The next morning, she started. Over the following 8 months, Margaret Vane did the work of a quality systems manager, a plant process engineer, and a technical writer simultaneously, all while running the first shift at Caldwell Industrial. She standardized the plant's calibration records for every measuring instrument on the floor. Documented 23 work instructions that had previously existed only in the institutional memory of the senior welders. Created a corrective action log and trained the quality control staff on how to use it. Bert Hollis worked with her on the documentation, said it was the most organized quality system he'd seen since leaving aerospace. Did not say this as a compliment specifically, just as a fact. Tisdale left the process entirely to her. He signed the forms she brought him. Did not ask questions. The Defense Contract Management Agency sent an auditor in the 3rd week of February 1989. His name was Steve Morello. He was from the Pittsburgh office. He arrived at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning with a briefcase and a checklist that was 94 items long. He spent 2 days on the floor. Reviewed calibration records, work instructions, incoming material inspection records, corrective action logs, training documentation. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, he sat down across from Margaret in the supervisor's cage and went through the checklist item by item. 92 of the 94 items were compliant. The 2 non-compliant items were both in the record retention section. One was a filing organizational issue. The other was a document revision control gap from 1988 that she'd already flagged herself in the internal audit log. Morello looked at the internal audit log, looked at the date of her self-identified corrective action, said it was unusual for a plant to catch its own record retention issues before the formal audit. Most plants waited for the auditor to find them. She said she had a policy of finding problems before they found her. Morello wrote something in his notes. The audit closed with a conditional compliance finding. The 2 items had 30-day corrective action windows. She closed both in 9 days. The certification came through in April of 1989. Ebers called the day after the certification posted. Asked if Caldwell Industrial was ready to discuss a production contract. Said the Marine Corps had been watching the certification process. Said it had taken 22 months from first contact to certification. Said the fastest any new vendor had done it previously was 31 months. The contract discussion took 3 meetings, 2 at Caldwell, 1 at Quantico. Margaret attended all 3. Tisdale attended the first one, and then sent her to the second and third alone. Said he trusted her to handle it. The initial production contract was for 4,800 VERS brackets over 18 months at a unit price of $87.40. That was $419,520 total. Against an initial order, Caldwell also got a $45,000 tooling allowance for the specialized dies and fixtures needed for production. Margaret had specified the tooling requirements herself. The allowance covered 91% of actual cost. She managed the production run personally. Set up a dedicated line with 6 of the plant's best welders. Ran the first production brackets through the same vibration and thermal cycle tests she'd originally done in the prototype phase. Every bracket passed. The defect rate on the first run, 0. The VIRS brackets shipped to Camp Lejeune in November 1989. then to Twentinine Palms, then to units in Germany. Feedback came back through Ebers quarterly. Field reports. The brackets were being used on NEMP and WV roll bars, on field communication antenna mounts, on weapons platform bipod systems. The split-ring collar system worked the same way in the Saudi desert heat as it had in West Virginia, worked the same in German winter conditions. Worked when the Marines who assembled them had 6 hours of sleep and mud on their hands, and were doing it in under 4 minutes without a torque wrench. In December of 1989, a staff sergeant from 2nd Marine Division named Torres wrote a 3-paragraph equipment feedback report that got passed up the chain and eventually made its way to Ebers. Torres said the bracket was being called Iron SPECTRE by the unit. Said nobody knew why. Said the name had just appeared one day in common use. Said the mount was invisible when it worked and indestructible when you needed it. Ebers forwarded the report to Margaret. No comment, just the forwarded document. She filed it in the Quality Records folder. Kept working. The follow-on contract came in the spring of 1990. Larger, 11,200 units. New applications added: aircraft cockpit auxiliary equipment mounts, ship bulkhead installation brackets for communications hardware. The applications required slightly different collar tolerances. She redesigned 2 collar sizes. The new designs went through the same prototype and test cycle. Both passed on the first submission. The spring of 1990 also brought something else. The Marines sent a team to Caldwell Industrial for a vendor assessment visit. Standard process for expanded contracts. 4 people. 3 were logistics and procurement staff. The 4th was a young officer, a first lieutenant, recently through Bud/SLES training, on a temporary assignment to the Logistics Command as part of a career-broadening program. He walked through the plant with the assessment team, asking questions and taking notes. When the group reached the fabrication floor, the team leader introduced him to Margaret. The lieutenant looked at her for a moment. She was in her welding jacket and safety glasses with her hair tied back and a grease mark on her left forearm. He asked, genuinely, if she was supposed to be somewhere else. Said the floor was a restricted access area. The team leader corrected him quietly. Margaret did not react to it. Kept walking. Showed them the dedicated VERS production line. Showed them the calibration station. Showed them the first article inspection protocol she'd built into the process. Answered every technical question the procurement team asked. Answered the questions in the same order she'd answer them to Ebers or to Morello or to anyone else. The lieutenant did not ask another question for the rest of the tour. The assessment report came back compliant on all vendor performance categories. Ebers called after the report posted. Said the team had given high marks on process discipline and technical knowledge. Said one team member had specifically noted that the plant's quality culture was unusually strong for its size. He did not mention the lieutenant. The production contracts ran through 1995. By the end of 1994, Caldwell Industrial had shipped 34,700 VERS brackets to the Marine Corps and, through a NATO standardization agreement signed in 1993, to British and Canadian military forces as well. Total contract value over the 7 years, $3.1 million. The plant had added a second dedicated VERS line in 1992. Margaret had hired 2 engineers and trained them herself. The Iron SPECTRE name had made it into the official nomenclature by 1993. The procurement documents still called it the VERS bracket. The field manuals had started calling it Iron SPECTRE. Both names pointed to the same object. The Marines did not explain the discrepancy. Nobody asked them to. In 1995, the Marine Corps updated its modular equipment mount standards and opened a new competitive bid process for the next generation of brackets. Margaret designed the second generation system, submitted it. It won the competitive bid. The second-generation bracket was called the VERS 2 in the procurement documents. In the field, the Marines called it Iron SPECTRE 2. The retired Marine who ran the Nevada Procurement Review Board for the new contract bid later told Ebers, who eventually retired himself and wrote a brief memoir about military procurement, that the VERS 2 submission had been the highest-scoring technical proposal he'd reviewed in 31 years. He said it read like it had been written by someone who had actually watched equipment fail in the field, had actually thought about what it meant for a Marine with cold hands and no sleep to assemble something in under 4 minutes. Ebers put that in the memoir. Said Margaret Vane had designed both brackets without ever deploying anywhere. Said she'd learned what the field needed by reading every equipment feedback report that ever came back through his office. All 47 of them. Over 7 years. The young first lieutenant from the plant assessment visit in 1990 went on to serve 22 years before retiring as a colonel. He was at a Marine Corps procurement conference in Quantico in 2003 when a briefing was given on the VERS system's field performance history. The briefing included the original design specifications, the 1989 certification timeline, and the 22-month vendor certification record that still stood as the fastest in the command's history. The name on the original design documentation, Margaret Vane, Caldwell Industrial, Horner County, West Virginia. The colonel said nothing during the briefing, listened with his hands folded on the table. Margaret Vane retired from Caldwell Industrial in 2009. She had been running the Quality and Engineering Division since 1996. The VERS line was still in production on the day she left. The brackets had been field deployed on 4 continents in 7 distinct climate environments across 3 decades. Her husband Dale retired 3 months after she did. They had a small farm property outside of Sistersville that they'd been working on weekends for years. They moved there full-time in the fall of 2009. The Caldwell plant continued production of the VERS bracket under a new quality manager Margaret had trained over 3 years before leaving. The quality records she'd built from scratch in 1987 and 1988 were still the foundation of the plant's quality system. Updated annually. Still compliant. Still meeting the audit requirements that Morello had reviewed back in February of 1989. The split ring collar design she'd sketched at the drafting table in the spring of 1987 had never been improved on in any fundamental way. The second-generation bracket used a refined version of the same mechanism. The tolerances had been tightened. The materials had been updated in 1 collar size. The physics of the design were unchanged. It tightened under vibration. It expanded correctly under heat. It assembled in under 4 minutes. The Iron SPECTRE name was still in use as of 2019, in field manuals and in the informal shorthand of Marine units that used the mounting hardware. No official designation had ever adopted the name. No official designation needed to. The name had originated in the field, in Torres's feedback report in 1989, and it had lived entirely in field usage for 30 years. Invisible when working. Still there when needed. In Sistersville, the farm had a welding shed that Margaret had put up herself in 2010. She still worked in it on weekends. Mostly small fabrication, repair work for neighbors, a hay rake arm here, a trailer hitch there. She still used chromoly steel when the application called for it, still checked her tolerances with the same care she'd applied to every bracket that had ever left the Caldwell floor. On the shelf above the welding bench was a single production spec VERS bracket. First run, 1989, the serial number stamped at the collar reads CO01. The first one off the line. She'd kept it. It looked like nothing in particular. A steel split-ring collar assembly, powder-coated flat black, about the size of a man's fist. No identifying markings beyond the serial number and the Caldwell part stamp. Nothing that announced what it was or where it had been. It had held up communication equipment in the desert, on ships, in the cold. Still would if you asked it to.